thought today I would share some of my adventures in sourdough baking because I know that I'm not alone in that I found the process of sourdough baking, and still do, quite frankly, intimidating. Or I just wanted to jump right in. Even if it was an epic failure, I would still be learning something. So I was determined to start. I thought I would share just a little bit about maybe like the history of sourdough, and I'll get into, what happened along the way. They say you should have 10,000 hours before you start to teach something, and I have clocked in maybe like 6 to 8, maybe. If you want a really good source, go to Lisa Bass on Farmhouse on Boone. I will put the link in below. I will link her beginner sourdough recipe. She's been doing it for like 13 years, and her stuff looks amazing, all of it.
Now for a bit of history.
Sourdough was created, they say, with the Egyptians. They were saying that it started by accident and that they just combined flour and water. Previously, before that, they had unleavened bread, but then it mixed with the wild yeast in the air. Because yeast actually, which is something I didn't know, is all around us. It mixed with that unintentionally, and then it created this rise after they baked it, and sourdough was created and used ever since. And commercial yeast wasn't developed until much later. So I'm finding records of maybe like the 19th century. So for all that time, people had to ferment their grains, and they had to soak their grains. And what they're saying is this is a huge perk of sourdough, is that it has the health benefit of removing something called phytic acid, which they say actually grabs onto minerals, and it makes nutrients less able to be absorbed into the body. So through the soaking and fermentation process of sourdough, because it takes, just for this one bread that I'm making now, 48, 72 hours before you bake it. So through this process, it's supposed to make these nutrients more bioavailable, more readily absorbed by your body. And I guess that leads into the why of sourdough baking. Why should I do this? Because, like I said, it is a commitment of time. There is a little bit of maintenance involved, and yeah, it's not like you are on the sourdough's timeline, not your own. So it does need that long period to ferment and soak, and the health benefit that I just discussed is a huge main one. Also, there is something that I like to call the intangibles, which is that working with my hands in this way, folding, stretching the dough, it's really rewarding. And that's something that money can't buy, because I did look into how much it would be if I were to buy. I've been using half einkorn, half all-purpose flour. So I looked up what an einkorn, organic, sourdough, genuine sourdough, because sometimes there are bakeries that, I guess, they add vinegar or other artificial flavoring agents to create the sour taste, but it doesn't have the actual long fermentation. So yeah, an authentic sourdough bread and I found one through a small bakery, $22. And for some of you, maybe you're willing to spend that. So let's say you go through a loaf of bread a week, which I think is pretty conservative, depending on how big your family is and how much you eat. But let's say you want to spend $88, and I don't think that was including shipping. So $88 a month on bread. If you can afford that comfortably, I am hard pressed to tell you why, making this would have as much of an appeal for you, except for, like I said, the reward of using your hands in that way, having this skill that could be useful at some point in the future. I'm not like a doomsdayer, but you never know what could happen. Maybe you can't buy bread or something, so it's nice to know that you could make something from home. But anyway, those are some of my whys for why I want to do that. I wanted a high quality product. So if you buy bread from the store, look at the ingredients. You might even buy a pretty high quality one, but it's hard to find something shelf stable that has the only ingredients being flour, water, salt, and your starter, which is composed of flour and water initially. So the simplicity of the product is really beautiful as well. So I decided that I wanted to delve into sourdough baking, and I decided I was going to make my starter, because then I knew I could get starter from other people, but this way I knew exactly what was going into it, and I just wanted to create my own. So I started one with rye flour, and I also used water. And the rye flour has something higher. I believe it's called, I'm not solid on this, but something called like phytase, I think. And that is supposed to create a better starter or create it more easily, I think. So that's just what I did. So I used the rye flour and the water, and I had it going, and I had it going for, I think it was like day 3 or day 4. And all of a sudden, I noticed I used a piece of like cloth secured by a flimsy rubber band, and it like had blown off because of the, I guess, the gas created through the fermentation process. And there was like, I just woke up one morning and I looked at it and there was just like goop everywhere, and the lid had come off, and I don't even know how long it had been sitting open because I don't know when it happened. It was just like sometime overnight. So I felt like, because I was like, you know, like I said, on day 3 or day 4, I was in too deep at this point. So I wasn't going to chuck it. So I just continued on, and I was like, this is going to be a really good experiment. And I want to let you know that my starter survived. I just kept going along with the process, and I have gotten some good loaves of bread from it. So things can happen along the way. I even Googled, I was like, what happens if your sourdough starter like explodes or something? And I couldn't, I mean, I spent like a lot of time looking into it, but I didn't really see any readily available results. So use a strong rubber band or hair tie would be my suggestion if you're gonna do it. Once I had my sourdough starter ready, I was ready to create my first loaf of bread, and it was not super easy. I mean, I had to like keep looking at the directions. I wasn't really sure, you know, she has a video on it too, and so I was like following her video, and I just had to remind myself, like, the first time you do anything, it's gonna be difficult and awkward. So my first loaf was like, it was actually pretty good. It wasn't like terrible. I mean, I think that my subsequent loaves were definitely better, but it tasted good. So I just kept going along, and at this point that I'm filming, I haven't done any other sourdough recipes because I just want to get this one recipe down. So I am in the middle of making my 4th loaf now, and I feel like each one has gotten better and better. And the other thing too is, like with my first 2 loaves, like my second one, I got this really good thing, I think it's called an ear, and it just got like really burnt. And so I have this, I love my oven, but I don't want to digress too far into that, but it's old and it's just really reliable. I had to figure out the optimal time and temperature for my oven because the oven from the recipe isn't going to be the same as mine. So part of the process for me was adjusting temperatures and times a little bit. I'd also like to ask you, because I'm sure there are a lot of seasoned sourdough bakers out there, to share in the comments below what your favorite thing is to bake with sourdough. Because I know that one of my friends, I found out she made pasta with it, and I was like totally shocked. I didn't know there was such a thing as sourdough pasta. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear about all the different things you like baking. The other thing that I tried is I try not to buy additional things if I don't absolutely have to. And so when I saw a bread lame, which is basically like a long handled stick with a razor attached to it to make those scoring, those beautiful patterns that you associate with sourdough bread, or at least I do, I was like, I don't need one of those. I'm just gonna use a razor blade that I have. And so I did, and you can. But if part of it is part of like the creative process and you want to make these really beautiful designs, I do recommend investing the money in a bread lame. I will share the one that I bought below. There's tons of them, but I do think it is worth that little bit of extra money if part of it, like I said, is creating those beautiful artistic designs. It just makes it a lot easier. I think something else that built up my confidence leading up to sourdough baking is that I make kefir at home, and so I was already kind of used to having to maintain something that was alive. I heard somewhere someone refer to sourdough bread as a millennial's Tamagotchi. You know, like those things that you used to have to take care of. I swear, like kefir grains, they can smell your fear. So I think that that is the same with sourdough starter. I do. And so just go into it with an air of confidence that you can do it, and I think that you will have success. Let's talk about the sourdough starter. So now that I'm baking these loaves of bread and whatnot, part of the reason why I didn't want to do this either is because I was like, I don't want to feed and maintain a starter constantly, because I don't bake that often. I mean, bake pretty often, but we're not a huge family, and It's not something where I need starter on hand all the time. And I thought that like if I did this, I'd have to be doing like sourdough discard, meaning throwing away some of my starter, and you don't have to do that. So everyone's situation is going to be unique as far as how much you want to bake and how often you want to bake, and know that it can be somewhat flexible. Because I didn't know that, and I wish I would have, because then maybe I would have started sooner. But I'm also going to link a video from Shay Elliott from the Elliott Homestead, because she has a really great technique, and I think she's also been doing this for a really long time, of keeping her starter. She keeps more of a dry starter, and the drier the starter means the less often you have to feed it. So, you know, if you see that like really kind of like soupy starter, that means you have to feed it more often. Right now, as I'm kind of getting into the flow of things, what I am finding is working for us is I keep a jar of starter in my fridge. So I don't keep it as dry as Shay Elliott does, and I also don't keep it as like wet and active as Lisa Bass does. Somewhere in between. So it's in a jar, it's in the back of my fridge to stay nice and cool, and then I just kind of wake it up the day before I mix up the dough for the bread. And it seems to allow me the most flexibility. I can just kind of pull it out when I need to. I did discover one day, I saw this like kind of clearish brown layer on the top of it, and I didn't freak out right away because like I said, I've made kefir before, and so I'm used to like the layer of whey being on top, so I didn't necessarily think it was bad. And it's not, it's something called hooch, and it's basically mostly alcohol, and it's a byproduct of the fermentation process. So if you see that, some people mix it in. I poured most of mine off, but I'm sure a little bit got mixed back in. And I'm told that as long as you don't see orange and pink streaks in the starter, then you're okay and you can still continue using it. So that is something that could happen too, that they don't necessarily talk about when they're talking about sourdough starters. I'm interested to see how you all feel about this video, because it didn't really have a point. I just kind of rambled about sourdough, and if anything, I just want to give you encouragement that if you're scared to try sourdough, and if it's something that you want to do that makes sense for you and your family, then do it, because it's the worst that's going to happen. You mess up, or you have to throw away your starter, start again. You know, it's not going to be the end of the world, and everyone's different. But like I said, I found it really, really rewarding and really comforting to know that I could make a beautiful loaf of bread out of just flour, water, and salt, really. And I don't know, I think it's something worth doing personally. So that's all I have for today, and I will see you all again soon.